All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a highly provocative, honestly pretty cynical theory from our source material about the true biological nature of political power. Most of the time when we study civics or political science, we get this really sanitized view of how leadership works, right? But the text we're looking at today, it literally rips the facade right off that idea. It forces us to look at the mechanics of rule, not through some lens of idealism, but through raw human biology and the primal urge to dominate.
We're starting right out of the gate with the source's core thesis, and wow, it does not pull any punches. Quote, leaving power is fundamentally abnormal. Think about that. This completely shatters that standard civic education narrative we've all heard, that power is just this baton gracefully passed from one hand to the next for the greater good. The author argues that whether someone gets to the top through a democratic ballot box or the barrel of a gun, the impulse to hold that ground isn't just some political strategy, it's a deeply embedded biological drive. Letting someone else exercise power when you hold it is, according to this view, a total deviation from the natural order.
And because of that, we have to re-examine the stories we're taught. We often hear the myth of the noble leader. We celebrate the Roman leader, Cincinnatus, who supposedly left his plow to save the state and then went right back to farming. Or George Washington, the American Cincinnatus, walking away after 2 terms. But the text argues these figures are famous precisely because they're the rare exceptions that prove the rule. The reality? The natural human inclination is to use power to keep yourself firmly in the saddle. The source challenges us to look at those historical heroes as massive outliers rather than the standard.
To ground this philosophical argument in hard data, the source points to modern examples, specifically post-Cold War Africa. And the numbers are wild. Less than 10% of presidents in that demographic voluntarily relinquished power without external pressure. The overwhelming majority, 90%, had to be forced out, died in office, or just clung to their position. So it paints a really stark picture of just how incredibly rare a voluntary exit truly is, even in our modern times.
And then there's this statistic regarding the tenacity of rule, 70%. The source asserts that roughly 70% of leaders who actually faced legal term limits simply changed their constitutions to gain more time. No way around it. They didn't just pack their bags when the clock ran out. They literally rewrote the rules of the game to satisfy that biological impulse to remain in control. Moving on to our next section, managing administrative friction. Because if the natural impulse is to hold on to power forever, you might be wondering, what exactly is the point of parliaments, courts, and voting booths? We usually think of these systems as the absolute pinnacle of human freedom, but the author takes a much more mechanical view. Instead of seeing democratic institutions as majestic guardians of liberty, the text describes them merely as buffers. They are, quote, the cooling rods in a nuclear reactor. Think about the institutions in your own government. According to this theory, their primary job is just to smooth out friction and manage the incredible heat generated by a leader's desire to stay and the rising ambition of their rivals. If that tension isn't managed, that friction can literally burn a state to the ground. The source outlines this as a deeply mechanical process. It goes like this. First, tension builds around the seat of power. It always does. Second, to prevent a total explosion, the administrative system steps in and puts mass in the path of ambitious rivals. It creates what the author calls organized certainty, basically a structured way to share or circulate power among the elite class. This lowers the friction and prevents the total collapse of the container, which, in this analogy, is the state itself. Now, have you ever noticed how, over time, the exact same types of people always seem to end up in charge? The crucial point here, drawing on the sociologist Robert Mitchell's, is that even when this system successfully circulates power, it never truly returns to the masses. Mitchell's coined the iron law of oligarchy, which states that all organizations, no matter how democratic they start, inevitably become oligarchies led by a professionalized elite. Power simply shifts from one set of elites to another just to keep the machine running smoothly. To make its case, the text synthesizes several elite theorists. You have Pareto arguing that elites fall when they lose their aggression. Then there's Mosca, noting that an organized minority will always, inevitably, rule an unorganized majority. And of course, Michels with his iron law. Putting it all together, according to these theorists, the ruling elite is essentially a slow-moving river of transformation, completely distinct from the constant, unchanging backdrop of the everyday masses. This brings us to the next section, the weak versus the chosen. This is where the source's most charged and provocative arguments really come into play. The text asserts a highly controversial view. Only a weak leader lets power pass. According to this framework, When a leader starts to care more about their legacy in the eyes of the masses, when they worry about public opinion more than exercising their own will, they've become weak. They are no longer what the text calls the chosen. Relying again on Pareto's theories, the author argues that successful rule actually requires what Pareto called class 2 residues. Now, what does that mean? It's essentially the persistence of aggression. The argument is that a declining elite loses this vital aggression. They start becoming softer, milder, and more humane. And paradoxically, it's this exact softening that leads to their downfall. The chosen, in this view, do not fight to destroy themselves by stepping down. They fight to maintain their rule, plain and simple. To explain this biological divide, the text leans heavily on Machiavelli. The idea is that nature simply does not groom everyone with the exact same desires. Humanity is basically split. On one side, there are the great, those who possess a boundless biological desire to dominate and command. And on the other side, there are the people, who simply desire not to be dominated. The text makes the case that a ruler shouldn't apologize for fulfilling a nature that others simply lack. So, where does that leave the rest of us? The majority of people? Well, this perspective asserts that the mass follower is merely the instrumental backdrop. They are subject to apathy, they need guidance, they are the clay rather than the potter. The text claims the masses are meant to either cheer for the leader's glory, basically decorating the melody of power, or cry at their arrogance. Without a leader, as Machiavelli noted, the mass is headless and totally harmless. Finally, we reach our last section, the ultimate limit of rule. So, if a truly strong leader refuses to be slowed down by administrative friction and refuses to succumb to the quote-unquote weakness of stepping aside, what actually stops them? The answer lies in what political scientists call personalist regimes. In these systems, the locus of authority completely moves from the institution right to the individual. The state effectively is the leader. Institutions aren't co-equal partners here, they're just extensions of the leader's persona. The text points to historical figures like the Roman Emperor Caligula or modern autocrats like Paul Biya and Yoweri Museveni. In these cases, term limits are viewed not as sacred vows, but as artificial expiration dates slapped onto a container that's still full of vitality. For these kinds of leaders, the act of stepping down isn't just a peaceful transition, it's an amputation. To transfer power is to literally destroy a part of themselves. Because of that, the only true natural limit to their rule is the physical death of the container itself. They are going to hold the stick and roll until they physically no longer can. Which brings us to a final, incredibly provocative question derived straight from the text. If nature truly does not groom everyone the same, is it arrogance for a leader to hold on to power, or is it simply weakness to let it go? It's a cynical, entirely unapologetic view of human nature, right? And it completely challenges the very foundations of how we're taught to view government. Regardless of whether you agree with this biological framework or find it deeply disturbing, it definitely forces us to analyze the often hidden, visceral mechanics of how power truly operates in our world. So keep this framework in mind the next time you watch a political transition or, a leader who simply refuses to leave.